thank you everyone. Really warm welcome to this morning. Really appreciate you coming through. We know there's some traffic barriers to getting here, so if you were here super early, we really appreciate all the efforts you made to be here. We want the conversation to really flow this morning, and I'm in a really unique position. I'm the only person on this panel that has no formal specialist early years training, so I'm quite excited to learn from Jan, Alexis and Alan, and we're going to try and really tell some stories through the work we do this morning with you, and then of course we really want your questions. So the grand title of what we're here to do is to look at the evolution of play in early childhood education, and I'm just going to ask each of the panel to introduce themselves, just give themselves a little bit of a bio in their involvement in early years, and then we'll move through to some questions. So Jan, if I can start with you.
Hello, yes. Hello everyone, my name is Jan Dubiel. I'm a specialist in early childhood education. I spent a happy 15 years as an early years teacher, teaching children aged 3 to 7. I then went on to work in more strategic advisory roles, including with the English government. I'm now working as an independent early years specialist consultant internationally, and previous to this I was Director of Early Years for an international school group based in Southeast Asia, based in Hong Kong. So most of my experience has been in the UK, but I've found it really interesting being embedded in an international system. And actually seeing those perspectives kind of linked together. So my life's work for over 30 years, whatever, has been in understanding how we best support our youngest learners, how we best support those critical years of birth to 7, but also how we understand it and how we represent it as adults, and particularly as teachers and educators. Because it is probably one of the least well understood phases of education, but I think possibly the most important. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you. Alexis, could you tell us about your journey?
Oh, hi. Okay, I'm Alexis Farrell. So at the moment, obviously, I'm working in Year 1 at Alice Smith. I come from Brighton in the UK, so I actually trained in Brighton, and then I worked in schools in Brighton, predominantly in early years, reception and Year 1. And then I worked with other schools in Brighton looking at the early learning goals when the early learning goals came out, and I was able to work with lots of different schools, Montessori schools as well. And I think when I started teaching sometime over 20 years ago, things were quite different, and I remember my first teaching role in Year 1, and it felt very much like I was doing it to the children rather than we were doing it together. And I think that was the moment when my motivation kicked in about how this learning journey was a partnership between myself and the children, obviously the community and the parents, but within the classroom. And then I think we'll obviously talk more as we go through, but the way I kind of took myself on the journey through research and the little things that I could change, even in quite a state school that didn't have very much funding in Brighton, in some challenging area, how just making some really small changes to the classroom, to the environment for the children, just completely brought it alive, and it became more of a journey that we were all doing together, and the children owned their learning rather than that feeling that I had that I was doing to the children rather than we were learning together, and that's where it all kind of started for me.
And Alan, last but not least.
Sure. I think my passion for early years started with my mom, actually, who was an earlier sort of childcare provider. So in my house, I kind of did it as a part-time thing for years and years and years. And then my first degree was a degree in early years education, 0 to 7 years. And then I branched into teaching from there. And then my first post, actually internationally, was the head of a nursery, an open plan nursery of 130 students. And about 95% of the students could not speak English. So that was an interesting challenge. But that was fascinating, working in an open plan environment with a huge team, with some amazing students, and that was in Qatar. And then I suppose from there it's just that initial grounding and just continually being passionate and reading about early years over the years. I would go stronger than Jan, and I would say it's definitely the most critical part of education, not possibly. I would say it definitely is, in my opinion. And we'll talk about it today. We have lots of ideas on that.
Thanks everyone. So you can hear actually we've got this massive pool of expertise here on the panel that we're going to try and draw on this morning. I'm just thinking back to a conversation you and I had, Alan, about the structure at JB, and I'm just wondering if this is a really good opportunity with everyone here as to why we created a head of early years role, because we talked about it for weeks, if not months, about why it might be a bit of a game changer, and I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I suppose really it's in some ways it's just sensible thinking, to put it plainly and simply. It's just the understanding that children's development and children's learning as a result of how they develop, they're different at different periods in their life, and therefore the learning experiences and the overall experience that is needed to support the child to be successful and to flourish, it is different and does change over time. And therefore, by creating an early years and a juniors in particular, children in juniors go through lots of changes. There are different changes to children in early years, and I suppose both early years and juniors, it's not just one decision in early years, it's across the primary school, because obviously children are going through possible early puberty, they're going through physical changes in upper primary and emotional changes, and they learn in slightly different ways, developmentally differently. And in early years, for example, it's another specialised area of learning. So you've just, I suppose, sections of education where children require just different forms of support in order for them to be successful. And therefore, it just made absolute sense for us to structure the primary school in a way which will help us to developmentally, in appropriate ways, support children at different times in their education. So yeah, I think it was just a very sensible decision, really.
Okay, building on that sensible decision, I'm just thinking about the work you're doing, Jan, with the early years teams. Could you share with our group today what that looks like and what the journey ahead looks like?
Yeah, no, it's always fascinating coming here, and I work in a lot of international schools, and I think the sort of vibrancy and dynamism of what you do, and the reflective element of what you do is really exciting, and I think there's a really interesting journey ahead. So the role I've had actually for the past year, I first came here a year ago, is sort of several-fold. One of the things we started out looking at was the concept of curriculum in early years. What does a good curriculum in early years look like? What do we identify as the things that we want children to learn? That's what curriculum is. And we had a series of discussions and did quite a lot of work in structuring what we thought that would look like. So some of the content of that curriculum are things which might be called more predictable, like literacy, mathematics, understanding the world. But we also developed work around the concept of learning behaviours as being part of the curriculum. So things like metacognition, executive functioning, curiosity, creativity, while they're quite abstract in a sense, they're a fundamental, vital part of what children learn. They learn how to be learners. They learn how to manage information. They learn how to regulate their emotions. They learn how to socialise with other children. While they may not land on a traditional curriculum, they are a critical part of what we do. And a lot of the work I did when I came a year ago was kind of shaping that with the team, and looking at, as I said in my introduction, how we represent that. So I'll use the word assessment, although that might frighten you. It shouldn't do. Assessment is simply knowing the children you work with, and how we represent and demonstrate that learning. So alongside looking at what we wanted the children to learn, we looked at how we would represent and know that they were making progress. So that was a big piece of work that started about a year ago and is still ongoing, because curriculums, like anything else, are fluid and organic, and they will change and need adapting, and so on. So what I'm doing now in terms of this week is visiting the early years classrooms and looking at how we build in continuity and progression from preschool to year 2. So one of the things that's a real area of interest, and also sometimes a challenge in early years, is how we build on those existing skills and knowledges. Because learning in early years is so what we would describe as holistic, children are constantly in this flurry of cognitive development. Children are motivated to follow their ideas, to follow interests, and in doing that they pull together what they've been taught. So there's always this challenge of how do we ensure that momentum keeps building, that what they do in preschool, in terms of their starting point, if you like, how does that build on in reception, how does that build in year one, how does that culminate, if you like, in year two. So what I'm doing this week is visiting all the classrooms and the year groups in turn, and looking at exactly how we do that. How do we pull out those threads of development? How do we make sure critically that children's learning is challenged? And that's probably something we'll come back to. It's critical that children keep challenging and are challenged by the adults around them. One of the worst things that happen, particularly with very able children, is their learning becomes static, and that they get stuck in what they know and they do what they know. And actually what we teach them in early years, and that's which is why learning behaviour is so important, is how to continually go out of their comfort zone. Because when they do that, they create new neurological pathways, they create different ways of understanding and doing things, and all that builds this architecture of the brain by, in its first 7 years. Sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but yeah, that's what I'm doing this week. Yes.
It sounds really interesting, and I'm just thinking about where we're sat here. We've got a couple of pieces to our left and our right. And when you talk about play or the evolution of play, it might sound really easy or straightforward, but it's very intentional what you're saying there, in terms of making sure the child knows there are no limits to stretching their thinking and to pushing their way they're doing that. Alexis, could you help us understand what that might look like in a classroom here day to day?
Yeah, so I think I probably talk a little bit more simplistically like I'm with the children, but it's more about being open-ended. So maybe when I was small, lots of the things that you bought, lots of it was plastic, but you would buy the school, you would buy the stables, the farm, whereas lots of the resources, if you look around here, and it was one of the things when I first started teaching, that actually it made life a lot easier, and as an early teacher in the UK over 20 years ago, it was financially easier as well. If you have open-ended resources such as these, somebody comes in, they've just driven to school this morning and the sun was coming up over the Twin Towers, you can create the Twin Towers. Somebody at the weekend went with a visitor came over and off we went to, I don't know, the stables or the beach or anywhere, or a massive hotel, and it had a swimming pool, so here's your hotel. So these open-ended resources enable the children to bring their own interests, which I think is also what helps develop the curriculum. So the children, as we're saying, in early years, we want them to be able to be challenged and to challenge themselves, and they are making progress and developing from 3 up to 7. But also their interests are changing and the questions they will ask will change. So you can kind of come from them as well, in as much as ensuring that there is the challenge continues for them and that they are learning from their own interests. And things like these open-ended blocks that can be anything, obviously enable them to use all of their own ideas, to work collaboratively. You're then getting those friendships, that personal social that they need, the communication and language that they need. And then, and one example that I had, they were building a condo, these children working together, so many skills that they're developing that aren't necessarily what I have thought as a teacher is a traditional objective that I want them to do. But for example, in year 1, one of the things that comes up in science that's always been in year 1 curriculum is materials. And I remember a long time ago seeing people, you'd have sheets of paper and it had, pictures of a wooden house, it had a tin of soup, and you'd cut out all the different materials, the glass, the cardboard, whatever, and you'd cut it out and you'd stick it on a piece of paper, and one said paper and one said wood and one said metal. And I remember even then thinking, but that's all paper. We don't need to be doing this, those real life objects. So again, they're building here. We're talking about materials. They've been to this hotel, it's actually the Hard Rock Hotel in Penang, that has this amazing swimming pool. So they were like, oh, it's got this amazing swimming pool. So can we make the swimming pool? How are we going to make the swimming pool? Oh, it looked like this. So then they were having a big discussion. I was listening about they literally obviously just went and got a box and were about to pour the water into the box, and then somebody else is like, I've done that before, it's not going to work. So then everybody, there were quite a few children, probably maybe 5 or 6 children working on the Hard Rock Hotel, and with a mixture of materials. So they're already without any, because of what's available, it's all open-ended. They had blocks, but then they'd gone to the craft table and they'd got different things to add, and they had the tubes that were the slides, and they were talking about how to open the tubes up, and then how you have to add like the bracket part on so that you've got something to stick it down on, because otherwise it's not up, because they could walk underneath it at the Hard Rock Hotel, so we had to lift it. And then the really interesting thing was they all went off and went into the garden, and they took different materials to make the swimming pool, and then they tested, and again, no one was scared of failure. No one was scared of making a mistake. It didn't matter if you picked up your swimming pool and all the water came through, because we could just try again. So that was what was so important about all of this type of learning, is that they are building resilience, they're not scared to make mistakes, they will challenge themselves, they're talking to each other, there's trial and error, there's planning, they see through to the end. We don't want children, they're in flow for such an extended period of time with really, really strong engagement, building all those links in their brains and everything else, rather than giving them an activity that they do, finished, off we go. They need time to learn as well, time to spend and focus and develop their ideas. And that's just kind of one example, that just seeing those blocks suddenly came. So there was so much traditional kind of coverage of what we see as knowledge that they should have, alongside all the skills, but alongside all of those learning behaviours that Jan was just talking about. So we have to create opportunities for all of that learning to happen.
Thank you. You covered so many exciting things in there, Alexis, about resilience, about learning behaviours, about not having a fear of failure, not being restricted. Our beliefs in children came through really strongly there. Alan, can you talk about what underpins play in terms of the belief in the child?
Sure. I kind of think of it as maybe 2 elements. There's a sort of the pathways to the brain and the neurological kind of developments. So one of them is like play schemas. So I don't know if you guys have heard of schemas. So your basic schema idea is that it's a repeated behavior or a repeated pattern of action. And so the children in early toddlerhood, I think roughly, probably early toddlerhood, up to about 5 or 6 years old, they use schemas for numerous benefits to the child. Mainly is to develop an understanding of the world, kind of where they sit in the world, and then an understanding of themselves. So there's a real identity creation in early childhood. So by schemas, the play schemas I think there are about 8 or 9 play schemas. So it's things like rotation, orientation, transportation. And I'll give you examples of that. So a practical example would be if you go to the preschool garden. So if you go into the preschool garden, there's a circular track around the garden, and some children will get on a trike and they'll just do circles and circles and circles and circles. All right, and that's rotation. That's a rotation play schema. So what they're doing is they're doing a repeated action. And that action has lots of other areas coming into the experience, but overall it's helping the child to repeat something, to actually just understand that feeling and what it feels like. And another play schema is there's enveloping and enclosing, I think, is one. So in year 1, there's a common one in year 1 in the garden, directly opposite Alexis's classroom. So children will very often create a space where it's enclosed, and then they will use fabric and material to kind of be a roof, and they'll put themselves in the space. So what they're doing actually is they're organizing, bringing organization to an empty space and making sense of that space. And then also what they're doing is they're putting boundaries in place and giving sort of organization rules to the space, and then they'll involve friends in creating that space, and then they'll repeat that schema over and over and over. And what that does is, as I said, it allows the children to really make sense of just their experience, and also it gives them a sense of how everything connects. And of course what it does hugely is it allows the children to create other opportunities with other children, other resources at the same time, and draw other people into that experience and that schema. And so you will have children who have multiple schemas kind of going on at the same time. So you have the children in the preschool with the trikes, but they might be transporting at the same time. So they might have something in the back of the trike, and they're transporting plus rotating. So all of that is really important for neural pathways, brain development. It's really, really key. And the real key element to that is, as an adult, when you identify those schemas, there are opportunities then to do what Jan and Alexis were saying, which is to either extend or support or scaffold, but really to ensure that you're looking for opportunities to make it challenging. And then you are trying to empower and facilitate the child to actually decide, oh, I need to ramp up this activity, I need to bring in more challenge into the activity. And I suppose alongside that sort of neurological schema stuff is the, I mentioned to Sean this morning, is some of the work of some of the early educational philosophers in early years education. The big one for me is Frederick Froebel. So he was late 1700s into the 1800s, believe it or not. And what he talked about in terms of how children learn at that age is still absolutely on point for today. It's totally relevant today. So he's 300 years before his time, but he basically said things like, which we really know and which most early years educators would be very passionate about. So it's things like the interconnectedness of the experience in early childhood. So we don't compartmentalize the experience. So kind of what Alexis said, it's like we don't do a science activity here and it's just science, we finish it and then we move on to something else. So he talks about the just real interrelationship and interconnectedness of all learning. So for the child, learning is just one big thing. It's a holistic experience. It's not in kind of separate pathways or separate laneways. That's one. And then the other one was, he talks about autonomy, but autonomy is only possible if the adults working with the children believe in the child such that they build learning experiences from what the child can do, not what the child can't do. So sometimes in education there's an approach whereby you look at gaps, you try and fill those gaps, whereas in early years, your first kind of thinking in your mindset is, right, this child can do this, how can I nudge the child to what they can do next? And I'm not thinking about further on, and that's another one he said, his biggest one, and I can't believe this, like he was in the 1780s thinking this, but he was saying that basically early childhood is not a preparation for adult life. And it's not a preparation for the next stage in learning either. You really need to be very present with the child, and you just nudge the child to where they need to go next. It's not preparation for something in the future. And for us as early years people, I would say, for me that's education as a whole. It's it. Of course we do think about the future, but you've got to take it from what children can do right now. And one more that he talked about was the sort of unity of everything. So really, it's really a learning experience so the child feels like every living thing is interconnected, which was really, really cool. Again, so long ago. So all living things are interconnected, and therefore the learning experience needs to message that and needs to incorporate opportunities for the child to really understand that. So nature, being outside, living things, interactions between the living things, and developing the understanding in the child that learning is a very global world, holistic sort of experience, and it's a very process-oriented experience. And if you can provide those sort of opportunities as an adult, maybe we'll talk about it later, the key is the adult in really scaffolding that experience so that, like Jan was saying, those learning pursuits and that drive in the child, it's facilitated, and children naturally will do that, but the experience will actually really kind of augment that and make it kind of flow. Don't know if all that made sense. It was a bit of a ramble.
Just a pause and an observation from me. This is genuinely how we speak about children and education when you're not here. So this is not for you. It's great that you're here, hearing us, but this is not unusual for us to be talking like this and always thinking and always refining and always thinking about how do we intentionally build something for the children that is the most beneficial. So just thought it's worth saying that we do feel passionately, and actually this is not unusual for us. I'm going to move and switch gears and hope someone can help me break this down. If you were to say, Jan, what play is in kind of a bite-sized understanding of it, what is it? Because we've kind of described it from a variety of angles. It sounds quite complicated, but at its heart, what is it?
Well, first of all, building on from what you said, actually, Albert Einstein once said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I often think about that when we talk about early childhood education, because it is massively complex and massively sophisticated. And I think one of the things we struggle with, or we wrestle with, as early as educators is the perception that what we do is easy and straightforward and simple, and it really isn't. And I think what you just said, Sean, there is a good indicator of that. So the word play, and this is really interesting. Now, so I'll have to fully disclose here, I'm somewhat of a maverick in the community because I don't really like using the word play. And I'll explain what I mean before you attack me. What we've described already is, as you've seen, is highly complex, highly intricate, highly skilled. To be a good early years teacher, it requires an intuition, it requires a set of knowledges, it requires a set of skills. I often talk about having an infinite pedagogical repertoire. When you work with children, you know, the way Alexis described that learning, to enable that to happen, you have to be highly skilled and confident and tuned into individual children and what you want them to learn at a moment's notice to be able to enable that to happen. One of the joys, which and early years teaching isn't for everyone, I would say, and one of the things is that when as an early years teacher, you go into your classroom and you might have planned things and have an idea of that, but you can never ever predict what is going to happen in that day. Those of us who teach early years find that really exciting. People who don't work in early years find that absolutely terrifying, and that's good, because if everyone was an early years teacher, there'd be nothing else going on. So we need that kind of spread, don't we? So yeah, so back to the word play. So I think the word play is the wrong word to describe what happens. In English, certainly, when you look in the dictionary, the definition of the word play is something trivial. And nothing young children do is ever trivial. Everything they do has a sustained, intense purpose. They never do things just for the fun of it, in inverted commas. They do it because they have a purpose, they have an intention, they want to learn, they want to find out, they want to pursue an interest. Children drive themselves really hard. They follow their interests, and when they do that, they pull in all the learning that they have. They push themselves beyond what they know into new types of learning. And all this is happening. This happens hundreds of times a day in every early years classroom all around the world. So I think the word play is a misrepresentation of that, because it makes it sound quite trivial. And one of the things, I mean, we've talked about Frobel already, that the early years pioneers, what's really interesting reading them now is what they said then, and Frobel was one, Maria Montessori is another one, is as relevant now as it was then. Maria Montessori was writing at the end of the turn of the previous century, so sort of early 1900s. She set up sort of nursery schools in London and around the world. And she had a very interesting, similar view around the word play. She said play is the child's work. So we shouldn't call it play, we should call it work. So in Montessori schools, they talk about the child's work rather than play. So I think the language is important here, because, as I said at the beginning, how we represent children's learning really matters. What young children do is very serious. It's a serious business. Being a young child and that massive phase of development is an incredibly serious, important part of their life. So we need to be careful that we don't undervalue it. And I don't think people do that intentionally, but I think the word play is a really interesting way of describing it. So that's what I think, and I'll put that to one side, because that is a maverick view. Most people in early years don't agree with me on that, but that's fine. I'm happy to be in a minority of one. But the concept of it is really important, and there is agreement. I absolutely agree with that. So the idea of play is that children use their autonomy and their choice, and they follow what they want to do, what they choose to do, and in doing that, they increase and enact upon their learning. So the examples you've had already today are perfect examples of that. Children have an idea, they have an inspiration, they have something they're motivated to do. And then it's the skill of the educator in setting up an environment that enables that to happen, but an ethos where they're allowed to do that, where they have permission to try out anything, to follow wherever that learning takes them, and it's supported and valued and affirmed by the educator that makes that so powerful. So for me, the word play means acknowledging the power of the child as a learner. Of course, we teach children things. We teach direct skills. We teach them knowledge. We teach them literacy. We teach them numeracy. We teach them bodies of knowledge that they need. But the concept of play is how they take that and they make it meaningful to them. So when children play, what they do is they internalise and make sense of that knowledge. So again, a very simple example, a child might go into the sand area and they might count the number of shells that they're putting in a bucket. Now to do that, they have to know about a concept of number. They have to know about how to use those resources. They have to know how what permissions they have, if you like, or the ethos of allowing to go and do something that they choose to do themselves. So there is this this strong sort of symbiosis between the direct teaching but children's autonomy in taking that learning, and that's what is sometimes described as play. And the important thing is that you cannot learn in early years without both of those working together. If you just teach children stuff and tell them stuff, actually, we know from neuroscience, it gets lost. The brain, when it develops around about the age 7, when children move from early to middle childhood, the brain prunes all the neurological connections that you don't use. So connections that are flimsy, that aren't meaningful for the child, get lost. And it does that, so it creates space to strengthen, myelinate and embed the ones that are there. So we know that if children don't get the chance to go and play with those ideas, to use them for their own ideas, their own motivation, and Alan talked about this holistic notion. Children don't divide their learning into curriculum areas. That child who's putting the shells in the bucket doesn't say, well, I'm counting these, so this is mathematics, and then I'm filling it up to the top, and that's capacity, which is another mathematics. I'm using my physical development to do it. They don't think any of that. They just engage with the moment, and they multifacet all that learning at one point. And that's what I take to mean by play. It's respecting the autonomy of the child, but also recognising that's how learning is embedded and secured within that child. And it's having an environment and an ethos and skilled practitioners who enable that, but make that so powerful.
Thank you.
So that wasn't really a nutshell. It's a big nut.
It was a big nutshell.
A big nutshell.
Alexis, just building from that, if you're a parent in the audience thinking, how on earth do I try and mirror and support this at home? Do you have any guidance that you could share as to how to do that?
As a teacher and a mother, yeah, I mean, I think as a mother, yes, as a mother who's now got very grown-up children who were played a lot. I also have a husband who's an art teacher, so my children who are now quite grown up is basically, oh yeah, my mum plays and my dad does colouring in. So that's kind of like how we've been described when people say that play is very simplistic. Yeah, exactly. It's so complicated, and it's well, I think what you can do at home, I think sometimes at home, actually in some ways it lends itself more than maybe people imagine in a classroom, because you've got at home people coming round, and so I think it's really important. Apart from, it's not so much what you orchestrate as play. I mean, there's many things you can do if you want to do like learning, obviously when they're laying the table, those things, how many people, so how many plates will you have, how many pieces of cutlery, if you're putting a knife and a fork, or a knife, a fork and a spoon, I mean those types of things, but they're very much kind of an adult led. The child may well count, oh, I've got one extra person, and then you can jump in on that conversation and join in. But I kind of feel that at home, some of the things that really support the children is having those play dates, but also something that I remember very, very early in my training, somebody coming to talk to us about how much we model as adults, and how much, and Jan was talking about this yesterday, that children, they copy, they mimic everything, and it is the teacher thing where the number of times I've kind of got over it now, where they're sat with the phonics cards, or they're sat playing with some animals, and I can hear myself, and I'm like, oh, I said that. And it's, you do get used to it, but children will just mimic what the teachers do, they mimic what adults do. So they will mimic your friendships. So if you have people round, please have people round to your house, have people, model friendships, because those types of skills are the skills that often we don't realise as adults. We think about the things we teach our children, like learning them to learn, listening to them read, reading to them, we understand the value of that. Counting, looking at numbers, look at the numbers on the lift, all those things that we can do. But actually, what about those learning behaviours, the social skills, the speaking and the listening? So I was guilty too, putting our phone away, not having our phone there, not modelling that to the children, but just listening to the children, talking to the children, all of those things. But also socially, how do children develop social skills if we are not modelling that to them in our social environment? So all of those types of things. Okay, it's not play, but it's about how we model to our children, and just enjoying them, listening to them. What are they interested in? What would they like to do? Having time for them, just joining in and taking from what they are asking for, listening to their interests. What is it that they are choosing to do? What do you notice they're doing? And joining in and sometimes just sitting back and watching. Are we interacting with them? There's a great book in Julie Fisher, Interacting or Interfering, and as a teacher, that's been really important. But also I kind of brought that into my own home as well. Like, oh yeah, my children are playing. I feel like I want to get in there, but actually, I get in there and everyone stops and then they start arguing and the cat comes in. And actually everyone was fine until I decided I wanted, So also looking at the situation, observing what's happening, and just using real life things as well. Like, you don't need to get toys for your children, and it's great they want some things, but this was one of the things when I first went into teaching that really changed my classroom. Was we had a home corner, which is actually a super important place for children to talk about home, to have those normal conversations, to build those social skills with their friends, because it's something they are familiar with. But it's so interesting, isn't it? There's plastic food, plastic plates, plastic knives and forks that all end up in the plastic washing machine. However, fortunately over 20 years ago in Brighton, the charity shops where things were very cheap, and you could buy, I didn't go for glass, I was a bit careful, but in came the china, and I didn't get cups and saucers because I kind of figured in my school in Brighton there probably weren't many children at home with their families actually with a tea set, so I thought let's make it like their home. So we had mugs and we had the plates and we had some real food, or I bought some like loose parts. We had lots of old jewellery that we took apart, and then it had all the beautiful gems and the jewels that they just had in bowls that could be different types of food. So, but real life, different textures, all of those types of things really transformed. That was what transformed my home corner. And then I was like, right, the next thing I can do is the book corner. And there was a really lovely lady and she gave me some cushions, and we were able to create like the home corner then, which was more of a kitchen and a table area. And then it went into like the book corner, which was more like their living room. And then I was able to extend that in lots of kind of teacher ways, with notes and envelopes and making lists and taking orders and bringing in money and real money, because actually you can get a lot of 1p's for £5, so you don't have to have plastic money. So real money and all those sorts of things. And the change in my classroom, the interactions, the engagement, the language, all of those things just from those really small tweaks, was just what really set me on this journey. And it was like they were such easy things, but seeing the difference. So again, at home, you've got so many things at home, real life things that you can use with the children. That's what you're using. That's what, how excited is that child? Not too young, but if dad does woodwork, as soon as you supervise them, you let them use the saw and the screwdriver and not plastic, they will be careful. None of my china plates went into the plastic washing machine. They picked them up so carefully, they handed them so carefully to each other, the cups, because that's what you do with those things. So I would say at home, I'm sure you're all doing it anyway, but just think about social interactions. Everything you do for your children, you are modelling for your children. They are copying. And just enjoy them, because as we said, it's not preparing for the next step. And as somebody whose oldest one left home a year ago and cannot believe it goes by very, very quickly. So spend time with them at each of their stages, whatever that stage is. Go with them on that stage.
What I'd add to Alexis actually is actually be present. It's something that you sometimes forget as a parent. And Alexis said it a number of times without saying those words, but for me as a parent, I need to practice what I preach, but especially when children are young, is just be as present as possible. Our lives are busy, but it's really listening to your child, encouraging questions and curiosities and wonderings, because they will have thousands of them. But it's listening to those and then finding ways where they can pursue them actually at home. And there are loads of simple ways of doing that. So one, for example, would be a giant box of junk. So all your recycled junk at home, throw it all in a box and they can junk model. And like children at that age will junk model for hours, days and days and days, creating and making, and you be present when they are junk modeling. You know what I mean by junk modeling, right? Yeah. So yeah, and you be present when they're doing that. Don't say anything, just be there, and you know, follow their lead, and let them ask questions. And I mentioned to Sean this morning, another person, Kath Murdoch, talks about car journeys are thinking times. Your children will think deeply in the back of the car about all sorts of things, and usually they come up with, Daddy or Mummy, why does this happen, or what's happening there? And don't ignore that, or don't say, oh, I don't know, or you know, or say, I'm driving, I don't want to talk to you, or whatever. You be present and listen to their wonderings and see if you can help them pursue the wondering. It's really, really important, because eventually, we were talking this morning, usually that dies out for, well, there's other reasons for that, but usually they stop asking these questions. And we can talk about that another time maybe, but it's such a key moment, and being present is so important. It's critical, I would say.
So for the audience, can you just raise your hand if you have a child in the early years? Is it everyone or nearly everybody? And how many people have a child that's in a different part of the school who's maybe slightly older? Okay, interesting. So just to pick up on something Alan said, and this is just a kind of your 2-minute warning that if you've got a question, we're going to give you an opportunity in a couple of minutes. But we were talking about the average study of the number of questions a child asks. So it's 40,000 is the average, if you look it up, between the ages of 2 and 5. And I'm just wondering if you can have a think, what would your guess be for a child between the ages of 14 and 17? How many questions will they ask the adults who they're close to in their life? I'm just going to give you a moment to have a think, maybe confer with the people next to you. 40,000 age 2 to 5, what would you guess ages 14 to 17? Anyone going to throw a number out?
500. 1,000.
Much less. 500.
Yeah, much less for sure. Yeah, between 500 and about 750. And actually that's probably the upper reaches of that. So one of the things that we were thinking about as educators this morning, I'm from a secondary background, is how do we keep our children really connected and pushing themselves with those learning behaviours? If they acquire them and they refine them in early years, how do you keep that paying forward? So that when your child's 17, you may not want 40,000 questions between the ages of 14 and 17, and they may not have 40,000 questions for you, but you might want 5,000 really smart questions about the world during that period. So how do we keep that going? Any ideas from the panel? Any advice for any other parts of the school from your knowledge of early years?
Well, for me, it's about how we approach learning. Actually, it makes me think of a classic example. As Jamie's at the back there. So when we recruit, Jamie Thistleton, one of our vice principals, when we recruit, we ask the teachers to teach us. So one of the aspects of the interview process is the teachers have to teach me and Jamie usually, and treat us like students, so we understand how it feels like to be in their class. And recently we've had some interviews where the candidate taught us, and at the end of the lesson, actually, and the end of in the interview, I wanted to pursue aspects of the lesson myself as an adult. And we were talking afterwards, actually, that made me think about, how we approach learning with our students is key to that, because if I'm like nearly 50 and wanting to, after a very short 10-minute experience, pursue something that's really stimulated my curiosity and inspired me to go, I really want to find that out and learn more about that and pursue it myself, and I don't need anybody else involved, I just have to do that, then we need to ask, like, why isn't every aspect of education like that? Because it isn't. So how we approach learning is in that sense is really key, because you want students, because for me I don't think it's right to have 750 questions at 14 and have 40,000 when you're up to 6. I'm not comfortable with that. So and my son, who's in year 7, he still asks questions continually all the time. I don't want that to stop, and I shouldn't be stopping when I'm 50 either. I want to be that sort of active learner, that person who's inspired by different things and then has the sort of energy and passion to pursue it. We all want that lifelong, right? So, and we talk about lifelong learners all the time, but are we actually lifelong learners? I'm not sure. So I suppose it's how we approach learning and how we partner with the child in that learning experience as well, and what it looks like for the child. But of course you have the real world and the exit ticket of some sort of exam at some point, and all that as well. But again, that for me is not a barrier to that type of learning experience.
So should we look to our audience for any questions that you might have?
it's a really good question. I think it's one of the most acute dilemmas we have as a society, never mind as parents or educators, because the proliferation of technology has transformed all of our lives. I can remember not having a mobile phone. I can remember that, and it's not that long ago, in relatively speaking. Though I have a child who's in their 30s, so I'm kind of a stage on from that. So I think the role of technology is an inevitable fact of our lives, and I think we cannot not accept that. So the importance of early years is teaching children how to manage how to use it, because the issues we have about screen time and about technological addiction aren't just about that. They're about about behaviours and about self-control and about self-regulation. So I would absolutely say technology is incredibly valuable in informing and supporting children, and you've just given some fantastic examples of the sorts of questions that they will come out, and that is part of the world they will live in. But alongside that, as with everything else, we have a responsibility to support that and enable children to manage their own screen time and to see technology in the context of the wider world. Now, we've talked about Frobel. One of the other things that Frobel talked about was the practical nature of learning, how children learn with concrete things, they learn with objects, and you were talking about sorting materials on paper and how absurd that was, which is right. So children need a balance of things. They need a multi-sensory experience. If they just have technology, we're giving them a two-dimensional experience which isn't actually real. Technology isn't real. But they need a broad experience which includes all the things that we've talked about. So it's as with anything else. I'm not as worried about technology as I think some people are. I think it has limitations and there are dangers within it, and I think those are really obvious. But I think they fit within a general approach of how we enable children to manage the world they're going to live in. And if we restrict them technology, it will just make them want it even more. So it's about understanding that. But I like you, maybe not like you, but certainly when I'm in restaurants and there's a family and the children are all watching their phones, I'm thinking, why? Just stay at home and do that. Why? The point of going to a restaurant is you learn, as you were saying, about being social. So it's things like that and managing it, because it can be easy to give a child an iPad or give a child the phone. So it's understanding all those things as you would with anything else, as you would with different types of food or different types of exercise or other kinds of experiences, and we need to see it in that way.
So I find I can talk from teaching in an early years perspective, is that I very much believe in the way that we teach, is that again, like I was saying about real things, I teach, when I'm teaching maths, as we were saying, there are concepts and there are skills and there's knowledge that you need to teach the children, that they will then, what our hope is that they will be interested, and then in some way they will incorporate that in their play and they will transfer that and be doing that themselves independently and practicing or playing, whichever word we want to use, with those skills. So when I'm teaching maths, I show the skill, the objective, the knowledge, whatever it is, if it's adding, or I use resources, the things that are in my classroom. So I will take the gems, I might have, say, 3 dog puppets, and I will take the gems that could be food, and it might be that we are looking at, okay, more and less, but with more than one answer as well. So one dog has 5 biscuits, the other dog has 10 biscuits, this one in the middle has more than this one but less than this one. What is the answer? So it's kind of like bringing it alive in real life. So that's how I do it in my classroom, and I have to say, it's also the timing of it and getting the amount of time that you have the children, like how long do you sit them on the carpet for? Yes, there are some things we need to teach them, but being aware of what is going to teach them the knowledge but also excite them and interest them and bring that awe and wonder, whilst also they are getting that skill and learning, but also the appropriate amount of time that you are doing it, whether you're doing it in small groups. So I personally haven't had any children that would say I don't like maths, because like we're saying, even with the maths, although there are specific skills I'm teaching, it's still holistic along with other things. I mean, there's some obvious things that you can say about sand and capacity, but also measuring. But you know, when a child is measuring, they're always going to get the tape measures out. But again, you've got all those numbers, but then you've got how many more. You've got whatever they've built, or the teddies, whatever they're playing with, or they go around, they just measure furniture. They love measuring furniture, you know, but how much taller is the back of the chair than the table, and then they write all of that down. So that's kind of how in early years, they're really interested in that type of maths, in number, or you know, they've got the iPad, they go around trying to find 3D shapes. They're using 3D shapes all the time, and they're like, oh look, instead of saying that whatever it is like the object, they'll be like, oh, I found a cuboid, Mrs. Farrell, and you know, like, it's all of those types of things. So it's just keeping it really real for them and keeping it appropriate. And yeah, I find that using things that they are going to use definitely helps with, if you model with things that are then not out in the environment, it's making it a very separate experience. And that's, I think, for me, I have found in my experience that is when they tend not to be so interested, that they're not then practicing and going back over and trying with all those different things.
I think that's a little bit challenging to answer, because every home is different. So that's the first thing I would say, and every child is different as well. If I was to sort of generalize, I suppose, and give general advice, Alexis, you can come in as well, but I would say things like school is a busy place. I know your children very well, and they're really energetic and really busy and full on all day. They're driven and they pursue learning like unbelievably. And they do need a break, and if they are saying I'm tired, I would just leave it, and the last thing you want to do is battle with your child after a long day at school. So that's one thing I would advise. I suppose overall, like, what are you trying to do? You're looking at your child's life and learning journey as a long process. So what do you prioritize in that process? It would be things like, you know, how do I support my child to be self-motivated? How do I support my child to be self-regulated? So, you know, those kinds of things. So reading around self-motivation and what's that like for a parent, how do I foster that in my family and my children? I think that would be key, because children are generally self-motivated at school. So how can I just support that at home as well? And the self-regulation is also important. So, you know, that's a really good sign. If they are saying I'm too tired, that's them self-regulating and saying I'm too tired to do that. So you just listen to your child and go, this is not a good time to do reading. And really, again, there are different opinions on this in terms of learning at home and learning at school. But if they don't do reading at home, I mean, I would not worry about that, you know, too much, because their learning is happening at school. But equally, you know, in terms of the specifics of academics at home, I suppose it's a partnership with your child's class teacher as well. And you working with your child's class teacher and saying, look, you know, what advice would you have specifically for my child in terms of where they are with their learning, and how I can support my child specifically at home. And definitely your child's class teacher could definitely kind of really help you with that a little bit and give you advice so that it's not too much for your child, because they know your child very well, and it's the right balance. And yeah, I suppose, and it's a very day-to-day thing, isn't it? Because some days your children are really exhausted, and other days they can keep going until whatever time. Does that answer your question a little bit?
It helps a lot,
Yeah.
yes.
Again, I think since COVID, I think most people are kind of, well, there's headlines which are sort of alarming, and you know, talks of gaps and all these kind of things. I think I suppose I'd go back to what I said before. You can only begin a process of learning from where the child is now, and not think about, you know, gaps and things that are not there, and sort of work from there. Well, I think since COVID, what we have identified and what we have seen is there clearly were, I suppose, effects of COVID and the effects of a lack of socialization. And this, I think, Jan, you might know more, but I think in other schools across the world, what we have seen as well is that there has been a recovery. So children over time, if learning experiences are what they should be, and they begin to socialize in different ways at school or wherever, that naturally children, there is a trajectory that they were on pre-COVID, and if you imagine the trajectory is like that, and then COVID they've dipped under, what we've seen actually is they've begun to get back on the same trajectory but at a later point. So I don't know if I can give you specific advice on your children, but what I'm saying is trusting in, I suppose, a learning experience.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think research is coming out recently to show that there has been a catch up over that time. I would say that I think we don't really talk about COVID anymore, but we should not underestimate the impact it has had actually on all of us. Let's be fair, and we've kind of we're not processing it. One thing that worries me about the world is we're not processing this deeply traumatic thing, which has changed all our perceptions of the world, subjected us to all kinds of traumas, and we're just getting on as though it doesn't happen. But that's perhaps a separate issue. So I think that the children who've come out then, and we will be children who are starting school now in preschool, for example, they were born under lockdown. The impact of their enculturation and how their brains were formed at that time has been really dramatic. The most important advice I suppose I would say for the parent of an 8-year-old is just to be sensitive to what that child is saying, and to take the time to talk about what they've been through or what they're feeling and where they are in terms of that learning. I think children are very adaptive and they will catch up. And I think when they're supported by caring and loving adults, and they can ask questions and they can have tantrums and they can have bad days and they can be tired and not want to do things, when that is all part of their experience, I think that it regulates itself. So I think maybe part of the thing is not to overthink it, but just to respond to the needs of your child as they're growing, especially their emotional needs. And I think one of the most critical learning behaviours, particularly out of COVID, is the one about emotional literacy and the ability to manage your own emotions and also your own well-being. And that's about naming emotions and developing strategies for managing with them and so on. So I think we have been through what has been incredibly traumatic, but I think in fact the children will be the most best placed to work with it because they will adapt. They will adapt quite quickly.
I'd be curious as to why you send your children to Alice Smith, for example. So I think you described it to an extent. The experience at Alice Smith, obviously, we want it to be as holistic and broad as possible. So in that experience, which is a long experience, a long journey, if you're here with us for a number of years, is the child experiences multiple it has multiple and varied learning experiences, and within that long journey, the child finds their passions. So you'll find some of our, excuse me, so you'll find some of our year 6s, I'm thinking of one, and she will say that, when I discovered drama, I discovered my passion for performing and expressing myself. So I suppose our responsibility as a school is to make sure that the learning experience is rich and varied and broad and very holistic, so that children aren't thinking, I'm not good at one thing, so I'm not going to concentrate on that, or and within that journey as well, they're just finding things that they feel really, really passionate about. And I suppose it's similar, I guess, as a parent, in the sense that you're wanting to give your child an experience that's quite broad and quite varied, and they're experiencing different things. I'll give you a perfect example. It's my son who was really scared of climbing. You can see Mr. Ben at the back there. So both my sons actually were really scared of climbing, and it's that balance, I suppose, as well, if you know your child. So when can I push my child to be brave and take risks, and when is it too much for them? So as a parent, for us, it was like we just nudged them a little bit towards climbing. And our first son is, on the climbing team and has been on the climbing team for a number of years, but he started off being scared of climbing, and he wouldn't even come down the wall properly. He climbed down. And my second son is going through a similar experience, actually. So he's still a little bit, scared and nervous about climbing, but he's going to the EPA. And he's enjoying the EPA, and with Mr. Ray's expertise and support, which is amazing, he's starting to overcome his fears, and he's starting to actually probably really like climbing. So I suppose as a parent, it's the balance of what do I expose them to, making sure it's not too much exposure, making sure the balance is right between recreation and something that's on top of the school day, but ensuring that they are exposed to different avenues in different areas, so they can discover what they're most passionate about and maybe pursue that further. I think that's kind of what I would say.
I mean, I think that Howard Gardner's work on multiple tones is really interesting, and I'm very influential kind of in the day, some time ago. But it does make me think, though, that even when you have a passion as an adult and as an adolescent, you have something that you're like drama. Someone talks about. No learning is singular. Every passion, every learning requires lots of different elements of all disciplines in order for that to be successful. I wrote a piece recently and did a webinar about children's fascinations, and I used examples of dinosaurs, which is a very common fascination in early years. Children get very fascinated with the idea of dinosaurs, and they pursue it, and particularly with good teaching and a good environment, they're encouraged to pursue all that knowledge about dinosaurs. Now, if you think about that, how many learning domains and disciplines do you need? They understand about the Jurassic period and the time scales of that involved. They understand these complex terminologies like herbivore and omnivore, and long words like brachiosaurus and so on. To be interested in dinosaurs, you have to be interested in, and you have to have knowledge and mastery of all learning domains that enable that to happen. So when we talk about early years, and actually as I've listened to you speaking, it's just reminded me that the most important thing we do is we encourage them to be learners, to be interested in something, because whatever they're interested in, it could be dinosaurs, it could be volcanoes, it could be racing cars. In order to do that, they have to become multidimensional. They have to pull in all different types of learning for that to be successful, and that's the essence of how learning happens in early years. And I think this has been said by everyone else already, I think the most important thing you do as a parent is one, you're interested in what they're interested in. You validate that interest, because in doing that, you do all the things that you talked about. You buy them books, you show them documentaries, you talk to them about it, you go to museums, you go to whatever arena their interest lies in, and in doing that, you're filling all those ideas and accessing all that knowledge. And the second thing, and I did a session yesterday about the brain and how the young brain develops, and one of the most important things is the nature of interaction and conversation. And if we boil that down to one thing, it's known in the official terminology is serve and return. So like in a tennis match, when you serve a ball and you hit it back, we've discovered or come to the conclusion that is the most important thing you do as an adult, is to have open conversations with your child where there are lots of serves and returns. So you ask open-ended questions. An open-ended question is a question that doesn't have a right answer or a one-word answer. So you ask a question that invites a response from the child, and then you respond to that, and they might ask you a question. And the more serves and you return, this is very crude, but it's working out in terms of research. The more serves and returns you have in a conversation, the more complex the thinking that happens, the more that child makes neurological connections, the more they're then able to do all the things that we want them to. So if I was to give two pieces of advice, be interested in what they're interested in, and talk and listen to them in an open-ended way, have genuine dialogues with them, and that massively extends their neurological connections.
Thank you for joining us this morning, and thanks to the panel, a really inspiring, interesting conversation. And please do take a coffee or a tea or a pastry, and obviously we'll be here available to answer your questions. Thanks.